Good evening. Welcome all to SAIS Europe. I'm Nina Hall. I'm speaking to you all from, from Berlin actually, but on behalf of SAIS Europe. I'm the Assistant Professor of International Relations at Johns Hopkins. And this event I'm hosting with the Weizenbaum Institute, which is based in Berlin, and it's the German Internet Institute. So it's wonderful to be co-hosting today with you. The event, I'm delighted to welcome both of our speakers, who you can see here. I will present both of them briefly, and then I will hand over to Hahrie to present. Hahrie is the inaugural director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation at the Agora Institute and professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. She studies American politics and specializes in the study of civic and political participation, social movements, collective action, and organizing, particularly as it pertains to democratic revitalization. I first met Hahrie when she was the Anton Vonk Professor of Environmental Politics in the Department of Political Science at the University of California in Santa Barbara, just before she took up the job at Johns Hopkins, and have really enjoyed engaging with her earlier book, How Organizations Develop Activists, Civic Associations and Leadership in the 21st Century. The book's had a real impact on my research and on my teaching. I teach it in my class, Transnational Advocacy, which hopefully some of my students are here today. I think at least a couple of them said they were keen to come. And students I know really like the work and the differentiation you make between mobilizing and organizing. And I could see already some of those themes coming through in today's book. Harrie's work also manages to capture and convince both the academic audience and activists, which is not an easy feat. And I think we should really congratulate her for her previous work, and also this book, I'm sure, will be similar. She's published several other books, including Groundbreakers, How Obama's 2.2 million volunteers transformed campaigning in America, Move to Action, Motivation, Participation, and Inequality in American Politics. And her work has been published in all the major US journals, from the American Political Science Review, the American Sociological Review, to the Journal of the American Medical Association, and won numerous awards and she's published her work in media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post. So Hahrie will be presenting her recently published book, Prisms of the People, Power and Organizing in 21st Century America, which she co-authored with Elizabeth McKenna and Michelle Oyakawa. After Hahrie presents for around 30 to 35 minutes, I'll be handing over to Michael Vaughan, who is the discussant. So I'll introduce him briefly first. Michael is the postdoctoral researcher at the Weizenbaum Institute for the Network Society. He works in Research Group 15 on digitalization in the transnational public sphere. So welcome to you all from Weizenbaum and from that particular research group in particular. Michael received his PhD in government and international relations at the University of Sydney. His research interests include social movements, political participation, and the discursive dimension of mobilization around issues of economic inequality and tax justice. He's actually published some really interesting pieces, which I've been reading in the last week or two, or rereading again, on tax justice campaigns in the US and Australia. And we're now working together and asking questions about transnational mobilization on the far right. So I'm learning a lot also from the Weizenbaum and from Michael and his colleagues' expertise. So Hahrie, I'll hand over to you. All of those listening, please, when we get to Q&A, I would ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box. That will help us facilitate and make sure we get all of your questions. So thanks very much, and over to you, Hahrie.
Thanks, Nina. Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here with you all. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and what I really hope will be a discussion between all of us. Thank you also to the team at SAIS Europe and to that's an Agora Institute, and also the Weizenbaum for co-sponsoring the event. Really grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you all. I should say that when we scheduled the event, we thought the book would be out by now, but there have been a couple production delays. So the book actually isn't coming out until July. And so it's not quite out yet, but we're looking forward to having it out in the world, and excited to have the conversation and present the work with you all now and see what feedback that you all have. So I'm going to share my screen to share some slides. Does that work for you guys? Can you guys see this thing? Okay. Great. So as Nina said, so this is a project that's co-authored with Elizabeth McKenna and Michelle Oyakawa. And, really what we're trying to understand is ways in which sort of different groups have been organizing successfully to build the political power that they want in the United States. It focuses on the groups, a set of groups in the United States, but I'm happy to talk more about how some of these lessons might apply to other groups around the world. So, so this is the cover. We thought it would be out by now. I'm sorry it's not out yet, but it should be out this summer. And, hope that you all will give us feedback on it when it does come out. So as a preview for what I want to do today, I want to start just by framing the challenge that kind of brought us to the book. Really what we sort of started with was this notion that most social movements that are out there fail to win the kind of outcomes that they want. That in most cases, when a social movement mobilizes for change, that status quo is the most likely outcome. But that a lot of the theory that we had in sociology and political science and a lot of other disciplines that study social movements tell us more about what it is that movements need and less about how they're able to turn the resources that they have into the power that they want. And so the metaphor that we use is that it's akin to kind of giving a cook a list of ingredients that you need in order to make a dish, but not actually giving them the recipe for how these things all fit together. And not that anything that we do is going to offer a recipe for success, but we want to sort of think through whether or not there might be any common principles that we see across movements that have been successful in the United States over the years. And so we start with this question then of how vehicles of collective action build and exercise political power, given the improbability of the work that they're doing. And just to preview a little bit of what we're saying, I think part of what we're trying to argue for is two things that are distinct from the way social movements are commonly thought of in a lot of the literature. And so first is that we want to think more about the collective side of collective action. So arguably, I think a lot of the research on collective action focuses more on the action side, meaning how do we get people to do stuff, and focuses less on what does it mean for that action to actually be collective in some sense, right? For people to actually work with each other in a way that makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts. And second, we wanted to sort of focus more on questions of strategy, which are arguably harder to study because of the way in which strategy is so contingent. But we wanted to sort of think about whether or not there are strategic choices that some of these organizations were making that allowed them to sort of build the kind of power that they wanted. So I'll talk briefly about the methods. I'm happy to talk more about that in detail if people want. I'll go through an example of one of our case studies and then kind of work through the kind of argument of why we use the sort of logic of the prism, and then talk a little bit about how it might apply to other cases beyond the ones that we looked at. So just to sort of start with our question, so we start with this question of how organizations build and exercise political power given the improbability of our work. And the one thing that I would say about that is that the project was really motivated a couple of years ago when we were looking at a lot of data that was coming out, not only in the United States, but really around the world, that sort of showed there was basically this broken link between what we would think of as participation and political power. So that even if we were in a moment, I mean, some people were saying that we're in what's called like a movement moment, right? Where not only in the US, but all over the world, we're seeing people pour into the streets for pro-democracy movements, for human rights, for any range of different kind of issues where people are trying to sort of agitate governments or the state to take action on a wide variety of different issues. And what we're seeing is that in most cases, governments don't respond, right? That the status quo is that kind of likely outcome. And that's data that's been shown in, to be true in a range of different cases. And I think part of what we wanted to sort of think about as well, is there a way that we can learn from the outliers, that even if we look at the general trends, we know that that broken link is the null expectation, so to speak. But if we were to look at the outliers where there are cases of movements that we're able to break through, is there anything that we can learn from them? And when we started the study, I think that we went around, we talked to a lot of academics. We also talked to a lot of practitioners and organizers out there. And a lot of them kind of pushed back and said that, probably there isn't going to be anything that we're going to find, right? The null expectation, in a sense, is that when you go and look at the outliers, they're going to be outliers, meaning each of them are going to have broken through for idiosyncratic reasons, right? So maybe there is a charismatic leader, maybe there's a really particular set of political circumstances that came together that allowed the social movement to kind of break that trend and to break through. But it's probably unlikely that we'd find any kind of patterned pattern kind of practices that sort of worked across the movement. But we sort of argue that we felt like there were some pattern practices that we actually did did fine. And the metaphor that we use is the prism. And the reason why we use a prism is this idea that a prism, like a normal prism, right? What it does is it takes white light in, and then based on the design that's inside the heart of the prism, it will turn that white light into a vector of colorful light that it shoots out on the other side. And we felt that like the movements and the organizations that we found that were most likely to sort of succeed were the ones that essentially took people and their actions in, and were able to engage in a kind of transformative practice that then were able to sort of turn people's actions into the kind of political power that we needed. And so a lot of the questions that we were looking at is, what was that design at the heart of the prism, right? Like, what does the prism look like? What were the choices that the organizations and movements could make that allowed them to engage in that kind of transformative practice? And what we argue for is that there's a sort of different kind of strategic logic that underlies what we think of as these prisms relative to some of the dominant models of collective action that we have. And so in a lot of the dominant models of collective action that we have, when we think about sort of how they think about power, how they think about strategy, and how they think about building constituency, we think there are some distinct kind of distinctions that important distinctions that are worth making. So just to kind of go over a few of them here, usually when we sort of think about political building, a lot of the models of collective action that we have sort of think about the central challenge as one of trying to minimize the kind of free rider problem, right? How do we get as many people as possible to take action, given the temptation that everyone has to free ride? And the baseline assumption generally is that when you accrue enough actions by people, that there'll be responsiveness from political elites. And we felt that a lot of these models that have been developed in the 20th century were sort of no longer relevant in the 21st century, when it felt like most social movements that you see these days can't expect that kind of baseline responsiveness. And so instead, they have to focus instead on the kind of central challenge, the likelihood of challenges that movements will make. And so the central challenge is not just getting people to take action once, right? But instead to kind of generate the sort of loyalty and flexibility and resilience that a constituency needs to be able to kind of hang with a campaign over a long period of time. And so that led to a different kind of strategic logic, so that while in most models of collective action, what we're trying to do is kind of think about how can movements accrue the resources they need to get close to the decision makers that they want, right? So this could be generating money, it could be generating actions, generating members, people, whatever the things are, that would essentially allow them to gain access to power and to be able to advocate for the kind of things that we wanted. And we were to focus more on this idea that the organizations that we were looking at, just because they got access to decision makers, tended not to have any kind of guarantee, and in fact, that they would actually be able to negotiate for the power that they wanted. And so instead, the question was, what were the resources that they would be likely to have at that negotiating table? And the resources that they needed at the negotiating table were more than just like an aggregate number of people or actions that they wanted, but instead a kind of independent source of power that was grounded in a set of people who had the kind of flexibility and pragmatism that was necessary to be able to negotiate for the outcomes that they wanted. And so then we began to ask, okay, well, what does that mean for how they built these movements if what they were really looking for is a constituency that was grounded in this kind of flexible, pragmatic logic of negotiation? And so, we sort of, I'm not going to sort of talk through everything right now, but it sort of began to be clear that a lot of the choices that they made were about how do you sort of generate the kind of constituency that can actually hang with you over time in these kind of negotiations. And so, again, unlike most models of collective action that sort of focused on building kind of constituencies that were sort of tightly bound to each other, they were often more homogenous, and most of the relationships that activists had were with kind of leaders of the organization. We found that a lot of these movements that were the most successful actually built constituencies that bridged people across a range of different identities, had commitments where the commitments were more to people and each other as opposed to specific candidates or policies. So they're much more likely to be flexible over time. And that the kind of relationships that they had were grounded not in a sort of relationship between a member and a leader, but instead in horizontal relationships that were constantly changing over time. And that's what gave the movement the kind of dynamism and flexibility that it needed to be able to build the political power that it wanted over time. So that kind of previews the argument. But so a lot of you might be thinking, well, this doesn't sound right at all. Like, this does not sound like the kind of movements that I've seen. So how do you know? So let me just sort of talk through a little bit about how we did the research. So if we focus on the data and methods, the kind of basic idea was that if we were to think about social movement success, right, or political power of an organization, that roughly a lot of the existing research out there kind of focuses on these structural kind of contextual factors that are going to shape the extent to which an organization is able to win the kind of political power that it wants. And so here I'm thinking about things like, what is the nature of the political opportunities that an organization has, right? If I'm an organization that's working on infrastructure, for example, right now, in the United States, there's this huge political opportunity that has just opened up with the Biden administration's plan to invest heavily in infrastructure that could allow me to kind of, you know, win many more investments than I would have won a couple of years ago, right? So those kind of political opportunities really matter, right? Or kind of baseline sort of levels of public opinion in a constituency are all these kind of contextual factors that we know make a difference in the extent to which social movements kind of are able to kind of win success or not. And I think a lot of what we wanted to do is focus more on the organizational capabilities. So any political activist or any organizer that's working out in the world to try to make change has to contend with the world as it is, right? Those are the kind of structural and contextual factors that might be out there. But what we were interested in is, what are the places where organizers had agency to make a set of strategic choices that could shape their likelihood of increasing their political power, given a set of political circumstances that they had to face. And so we essentially sort of set up this multi-method kind of comparative case study where we focused on the outlier cases and essentially wanted to sort of see, you know, are there commonalities in the way organizations built political power, and can we observe what those sort of shifts in political power are? And the way that we went and identified the cases was we looked at sort of sub-national cases in the United States. We're focusing only on the United States. And we want to do is sort of say, well, if we look at cases where movements were actually able to sort of win the kind of success that they needed, can we sort of identify a set of cases that that actually vary on the kind of structural and contextual factors that we know already matter. So for example, we didn't want to identify cases that all were working in states that had Democratic governors, for example, because then we wouldn't be able to differentiate between whether they all had success because they were working with a friendly political administration or friendly political party, or if they had success because of some of the choices that they made inside. So what we did was try to identify cases that sort of varied on the kind of things that we already matter, but then sort of look at whether or not there are any commonalities in these organizational capabilities that we were looking at. And I'm going to skip this for now. If we look at the cases that we actually chose, and the way that we went about identifying cases, we did a bunch of expert interviews with informants across academia, philanthropy, movement organizers, like people that had a bird's eye view on a lot of work that was going on in the United States, and tried to identify what were the cases that seemed like they were the most successful. We started this project back in 2015. And so we're looking at cases that were operating around that time. And you know, we started with a bunch of these interviews, and then what we ended up identifying was that from our interviews, I think we did about 40 interviews, there were about 20 cases that were identified across those interviews, and about 10 of those cases came up in multiple interviews that we did. So we focused in on those 10 cases and then tried to identify how can we sort of select a subset of those cases that essentially varies on those factors, those structural factors that we already know matter. And we ended up with these 4 cases. And so essentially we were looking at a group named Lucha in Arizona that was focused on fighting for immigrant rights in Arizona. They were working primarily through municipal and regional kind of elections where they're and ballot initiatives at the state level, where they're trying to advance an agenda for immigrant rights in Arizona. We were looking at a set of organizations in Minnesota that was focused on trying to identify candidates in the 2018 primary and general election at the gubernatorial level that was trying to advance a vision of a more multiracial Minnesota than what has been kind of dominant in the state over time. We looked at an organization in Ohio that was focused on trying to fund universal preschool at K-12 in Cincinnati, which is a city in Ohio. And then finally, we looked at an organization in Virginia that was fighting for voting rights for formerly incarcerated citizens in the state. And so these are 4 different organizations that were working with different kinds of constituencies, different kinds of issues, and working in different domains. So some of them are working on gubernatorial elections, some of them are working on municipal elections, some of them are working on ballot initiatives, others are working on statewide policy. So they're working on a variety of different areas, and we're trying to understand whether or not there are any commonalities across them. They are organizations that all operate on the left, and I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A. Our primary reason for that was because in order to do the research that we wanted to do, we had to get access to the kind of internal operations of all these movements to be able to unpack whether or not there were any of those organizational capabilities that we talked to. And because my co-authors and I, all of us had worked in progressive politics in the past, we just have a much easier time getting internal access to the organizations on the left than we did on the right. But I think there are commonalities across movements that we see on the left and the right that I'm happy to talk more about if people wanted to. So essentially, just to kind of like, give you an example of one of the cases, in Ohio, we're looking at an organization that was fighting for universal preschool. And this battle for universal preschool had actually begun in 2001 when there was a police shooting of an unarmed Black man in 2001 in a neighborhood called the Over the Rhine neighborhood. And it sparked 3 days of an urban uprising that was the largest sort of urban uprising in the United States since the LA riots after Rodney King, and that caused millions of dollars of damage to the city, and essentially kind of sparked this conversation in the city about how do we begin to combat the root causes of the kind of racial disparities that we see in the city. And there are a variety of things around community policing and criminal justice reform that came out of it. But one of the other pieces that came out of it was this commitment to trying to work on universal preschool. And so there essentially was a commission that was led by a lot of the Fortune 500 companies in the city that basically backed a campaign through the United Way to try to fund universal preschool. And for the first kind of 8 years, they focused on trying to get privately funded universal preschool. They raised like $10 million. They started all these kind of centers, and they were able to sort of increase the kindergarten readiness rate from something like 44% to 55%. But they realized that they would never get to the kind of 85, 95% kindergarten readiness that they wanted unless they had a publicly funded system. So they had to sort of pivot to a publicly funded system. But in order to do that, they needed public support, right? And so they go and they talk to the city council, and the city council says, sure, if you can show that you have a lot of public support for this, then we'll support a publicly funded preschool system. And so they go out and they gather, they said they're going to gather 5,000 signatures in a petition drive in order to win, show that they had public support. And they ended up gathering 10,000 signatures, and they tabled at community fairs, they tabled outside grocery stores, they did all the things that you normally do to kind of get the sort of signature, the signature campaign that you win. But what ended up happening was that when they went to City Hall and said, hey, look, you told us to get 5,000 signatures and we got 10,000 signatures, like, aren't you going to fund universal preschool now? The city council essentially said, oh, actually, no, we're not going to do it. And when the city council pushed back on this campaign, but they realized that they had no real kind of grassroots base, right? That those 10,000 signatures that they had gathered were people who had said they support this in principle, but they hadn't really built that base. And then, so when they got the challenge from the city council, they had nothing that they could fall back on at that point. And so around the same time, what ended up happening was that there was an organization named AMOS that does faith-based organizing, a multiracial faith-based organizing in Cincinnati, and they began to get more active in the campaign. And so instead of just doing a petition drive, what they ended up doing was building a sort of, a kind of a more grounded kind of movement-based campaign for building a real constituency among the kind of poor Black community that would be the greatest beneficiaries of a universal preschool campaign. And essentially we're able to kind of build a base of support that was able to sort of push back on city council and win enough public support to pass a ballot initiative for universal preschool. And so the preschool ballot initiative actually won in 2016, which is the same year that Trump, won the presidential election. The ballot initiative was on the same, was voted for on the same day. And even though Trump won Ohio by something like 9 percentage points, the ballot initiative in Cincinnati passed by 24 percentage points, which is the largest margin that any new education levy had passed in the city. And this was an education levy that actually increased taxes on residents of Cincinnati, but nonetheless it passed. And so a lot of what we want to try to understand was that how were they able to sort of pass this ballot initiative, with such a large margin when this, sort of large, highly resourced kind of campaign had failed in the past. And the first thing that we were looking at is, we wanted to just sort of understand like whether or not the campaigns that we're looking at, even though we had done all these expert interviews, how we were able to sort of visualize the kind of political power that they built. And one of the things that we had done was sort of do these network surveys with key leaders from people who are working in Cincinnati on the business, on the preschool issue. And so we looked at everyone from, we did interviews with everyone from like the United Way to the policy community, the business community, and all these different people who had been involved. And what we found essentially was that while the leaders of this grassroots organization, AMOS, were not at all part of the power network in 2013 before they had gotten involved, by the time that the ballot initiative passed in 2016, they were at the center of the power network in this organization. And what's interesting is that not only were they at the center of the power network in terms of strategizing with all these different people, they were actually at the center of negotiating conflict, right? So a lot of the times what happens is that when grassroots organizations get into relationship with the business community or policymakers or other high level kind of political elites, very often it's hard for them to negotiate for power at the table because the business community and elected officials tend to hold so much more weight than a grassroots organization does. But because this grassroots organization was able to build a constituency that was its independent source of power, it didn't rely on the business community for its access to power, right? It had earned it because of the sort of base that it had built. And so what ended up happening was that they could sit at that negotiating table and actually negotiate and engage in conflict with other business leaders. And so when they were designing the preschool policy that actually got passed, they had to design it on a set of principles that AMOS really wanted. And these principles are principles that had been identified through a campaign that AMOS had built. It was things like targeted resources for the poorest kids in Cincinnati, good jobs for home daycare providers. So one of the things they were really afraid of is that having a universal preschool city program in the city would take away jobs from a lot of the primarily Black kind of women that ran home daycares in their homes. And so they wanted to make sure that the policy incorporated good wages and jobs for home daycare providers like that. And so there were things like that that they were able to negotiate for and win, and this is, which is why you see them at the center of this kind of like negotiating conflict map. And so essentially kind of the argument that we make that is that like in organizations like AMOS, right, and the other cases that we found, the commonality that we found was basically this idea of a prism, right? And so what is the sort of logic that underlies it? Well, so we start with this notion that instead of having kind of responsiveness from political elites, organizations like AMOS are always going to work in uncertain contexts, right? There's no guarantee that they're going to win, and there's no guarantee that the political elites will sort of grant them kind of access to power or even negotiate with them in the ways that they want. And so if you start with this assumption of uncertainty, then the goal for the organization is not to have the best strategic plan at the beginning of the campaign, but instead is to sort of maximize the set of choices that they have before them when they get challenged, right? And so this is a sort of like pivot that we make from, instead of trying to sort of maximize resources, the goal is to maximize strategic choice, right? And so the question then is, if I'm the head of an organization, I have no idea what kind of challenge I'm going to face 9 months from now, 6 months from now, 2 years from now, right? But I'm just trying to sort of do everything that I can right now to maximize the set of choices that I'm going to have when that inevitable challenge comes, a year, 2 years, 3 years, however long down the road that comes. So then the question becomes, okay, so what are the things that I can do to maximize strategic choice? And so what we argued is that in a grassroots organization where the primary source of political power is people, the kind of political power that you need are people that are essentially independent, flexible, and committed in terms of their constituency, right? So that you want to have a constituency base that is not beholden to anybody else, that is flexible, meaning that they'll be willing to sort of move pragmatically with the organization as it negotiates for different kinds of change, and that they're committed so that they won't leave the organization when the organization has to sort of shift strategies, tactics, candidates, whatever the thing might be. And so the question then is, how can I, as an organizer, begin to cultivate an organization that has those kind of characteristics? And that's where the organizational design choices really matter, is that the organizations that were able to make the design choices that cultivate those kind of characteristics were the ones that were the most successful. And so the characteristics then that the organizational design choices that the organizations made had to do with the way in which they put people into relationship with each other, right? So were people building horizontal relationships with each other? Were they leveraging weak ties, right? So were they putting people into relationship with people in the organization who might be different from them? Because what that does is that essentially sort of creates that sort of roiling kind of horizontal network within the organization that allows that base to become more flexible and committed over time. Second was this question of, were people being allowed to sort of strategize independently? So many organizations concentrate strategy in the hands of the staff, and these were organizations that were able to sort of distribute it throughout the movement in such a way that when you had situations like we saw in Amos, that when the city council, when the business leaders would push back on wanting to give good wages for home daycare providers, for example, Amos was always able to go back to its base and ask its base to sort of enter into conversation and negotiation with business leaders in the city in a way that was only possible if their base was educated, was informed, and ready to sort of take on that role of leading in those kinds of negotiations. And so I won't go into all the details here, but we sort of find that those are the kind of choices that we saw as being patterned across all the organizations that we studied. And so just to wrap up, the basic kind of idea behind the book is trying to figure out how organizations build political power, and the kind of key characteristics that sort of make that political power sort of more likely to emerge, essentially. But the basic kind of idea is that the way that organizations build their constituency internally is related to the way in which they're able to exercise power externally, right? So that there's a kind of mutually reinforcing relationship between how an organization builds its constituency and what kind of political power it's able to exercise. And so, one other way that I often talk about is idea that I think one of the things that we've lost in a lot of the ways in which we talk about politics is that very often the kind of micro practices through which we engage with each other shape the macro outcomes that we're likely to achieve. And I think that we have so much attention sometimes to all the kind of macro political dynamics that we must pay attention to whenever we're trying to make political change. But a lot of what becomes possible is shaped by the micro practices of how we engage with each other. So I'll pause there and stop my screen share. And I'm looking forward to the conversation with Michael and Nina and everyone else.
Thanks, Hahrie. That was fantastic and right on time. I'll pass over to Michael to present your comments, reflections, and any questions you might have. And then we'll go to the broader audience afterwards. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Nina, and thanks, Hahrie, for the presentation. I think it's done its first job in making me want to go and buy and read the book. So that's a good measure of success for book presentation. And I'm going to keep it relatively short initially so we can get questions from the group in the Q&A. But as Nina said, I work at the Weizenbaum Institute, the German Internet Institute. So a couple of my comments will probably come from that direction. And so I did want to raise the issue of national context to try and, I guess, get a better sense of that, because also I feel like probably some of the other people on the video webinar will be coming from outside the US. So I think that, the project is makes no bones about being US based, but a lot of the causes for this model seem very transferable. So, when you talk about the link between participation and politics and political power being broken, a lack of responsiveness of political elites, and the uncertainty that organisations and campaigners have to deal with, all of those factors seem like they would very much apply to Europe, back in Australia, a number of other countries. So I think it would be interesting to get your thoughts on how transferable you think you expect the model to be, given a lot of the drivers are so broadly felt. And then, I mean, it obviously opens up the possibility for people to test this kind of model in different national contexts, which sounds fantastic. But it made me think, this seems like tricky research to do in a way, because if you are aiming to get at the strategic choices that advocates are making, that is not easy data to get at. So maybe you could talk a bit about how that experience went, because apart from really detailed field work and a lot of interviews, it's hard to talk confidently about the priorities and goals that advocates have when they're weighing up these different decisions. And then I did want to ask another question about the idea of national context, because one thing that I think does vary between different countries is often a kind of specific culture of organising and advocacy that can develop in relation to fairly specific trajectories of power, and particularly these macro structural dynamics. So I'm thinking of periods of innovation that often happen as a result of this kind of out-party innovation thesis. And so then, you know, that given the big changes in the US in the past decade and in this period, I wonder whether the case studies that you are looking at, to what extent do the commonalities that they show signal any kind of diffusion or a shared culture of organising that might be a specific US story, or maybe not. And then I guess the Internet Institute part of my hat, I'm interested in asking about the digitalisation side of things. And I guess thinking about this opposition between if we think of a traditional collective action model and then this Prisms of people power model. And I mean, obviously digitalisation shapes both of those possibilities. But I'm almost tempted to think that it facilitates a traditional collective action model a bit more easily, because especially when you talk about the importance of these horizontal, strong relationships as being at the heart of really these constituencies that that get assembled. And that's not really the structure of digital communication networks, at least for the most part, as I'm familiar with them. So I'd be really curious if there are some thoughts you have based on the case studies about whether this is more of an offline relationship building model of organising. Does it translate into digital, or has digital gone from being this kind of utopian revolutionising politics to now digital is the kind of way to do traditional collective action, which would be kind of funny to me. I have other questions, but I'm going to save them in case there's a lull in the conversation, and looking forward to talking about it more.
Thanks, Michael. I'll just say, Hahrie, as you're addressing, there was a question also in the chat from Judy Zhang about how transferable do you think the concepts are to social movements in other countries. So there's a broad interest in Michael's question, one of his first ones.
Yeah, so I think, so to me, like the question about like how transferable the model is across national context and also digital, it's kind of like what's the external validity, you know, of the study. And so that's always, you know, whenever you're doing like case study research, like it's always a challenge, right? And so, you know, on the one hand, I will say like, yes, like I can't say exactly like how this is going to translate to other countries or to organizations that don't work with this kind of model, but And one of the things, and to be kind of like make that more concrete, like one of the things that we found, so for example, our whole kind of like research program kind of depends on this idea that you believe that the organizations that we were studying actually did shift political power in the ways that we did. So part of the reason why we did those network studies, we wanted to sort of actually say, like, can we sort of make visible the way in which they shifted power or not? You know, and that network graph from 2013 to 2016 sort of shows how they did move from like the margins of the power network to the kind of center of it in a different way. And so there are things like that, but in doing that research of sort of like thinking about how we measure the kind of, or make visible the kind of political power shifts, we realized that one of the things about that notion of measuring power is that it's highly contextually dependent, right? So the way in which we were measuring power in Ohio was different from the way in which we did it in Virginia, was different from how we did it in Arizona, was different from how we did it in Minnesota, right? And so they were very context dependent because each of those campaigns had a different strategy that they were using. So in Cincinnati, it was this business coalition that was the kind of like target of the sort of power work that the movement had to do. In Virginia, it was the Democratic state lawmakers in the state assembly, you know, and so we did like our network maps were with like the state assembly members in the state house. You know, in Arizona, they didn't really have a sort of like ballot or like legislative strategy. It was really much more about getting people elected to sort of office. And so what we looked at instead was how they shaped the kind of immigration policy agenda over time. And so I give these examples just to sort of say that, yes, I think there's an aspect of this work that is incredibly context dependent because each movement has to have a specific strategy that's grounded in who they are targeting to try to sort of negotiate for power with, you know? And so if you take seriously this idea of like a negotiation for power, then you have to have at least two parties at the table for that negotiation to occur. And that's very context dependent in that sense. So that's sort of like one way of thinking about it. But then the second thing is that like, you know, we've been really fortunate, and by we, I mean like my co-authors and I, and sort of the work that we've done like in the P3 lab to sort of work with movements, you know, that are working in Australia, in the UK, you know, in Europe, and like other places around the world. And I do think there are certain kind of commonalities to a lot of the things that I see that movements are struggling with, you know, and so are there ways in which they're each completely different? Like, yes, like one of the things that I'm always blown away by is that for movement organizations in the US, they spend so much time trying to figure out, like every time an election comes around, how do you get people out to vote, right? In Australia, we have mandatory voting, like it's just not a thing. And so it changes your strategy in like these radically different ways. So like, yes, there are kind of those differences, but we were trying to get at a set of what we thought of as kind of like more conceptual principles that would be applicable across lots of different kind of contexts, you know? So to me, the notion of uncertainty is applicable whether you're working in the United States or Australia or Germany or Italy or wherever you're working, right? The notion of the strategic choice set and pivoting from about thinking about your goal of maximizing resources to maximizing strategic choices is applicable whether you are a digital first movement or an offline movement. You know, like those things are, I think, universal across a set of different kind of movements. The last thing I'll say is that one organization that wasn't one of the cases in the book, but that we've done a lot of work with is an organization called Color of Change, which is a digital first Black-led organization in the US. And they're US focused, but they're working with, you know, it's a digital first organization that's trying to build kind of Black political power in the US. And, you know, what's interesting is that Color of Change like has adopted a lot of these kind of principles into thinking about sort of how they sort of build strategy in a variety of different ways, which sort of gives me a sense that there are, I think, kind of commonalities across kind of these digital contexts. I do agree with you that the sort of the design choices probably would vary, right? So if I was a digital only organization, what the design choices are that I would make are different than if I was an offline organization, but the principles are probably the same, right? Like I'm still trying to sort of put people into like interdependent horizontal relationship and sort of thinking about how do I use the tools that I have to sort of make those kinds of things more likely to happen. And sorry, this is like a really long answer, but I'll just say one more quick thing is I know you also asked a question about culture. And yes, that's a really great question. So these organizations, I think, are working in a culture that is unique to the United States. And so there is kind of learning that happens like across all these different kinds of organizations, because it's not like the person in Virginia has no idea what's going on in Arizona, right? Like, of course they do. And they're broadly part of these like ecosystems that are in conversation with each other. So yes, I think there absolutely are cultural scripts that get passed on from organization to organization. And the other way in which it matters is it also shapes the expectations that constituents have, right? That like if I'm a constituent in the United States, there's a certain set of cultural scripts that shape what I think I'm going to be asked to do. And when you ask me to do something different, I'm like, whoa, like I wasn't expecting that, right? And that I think does vary across different national contexts and across sort of both digital and offline contexts. But I will say the best organizations that we've seen in this study and across other studies are really good at kind of setting their own terms for what those cultural scripts are, you know, and so that no matter what kind of organization it is, they try to sort of create the culture even as they are working within one. So.
Thanks, Hahrie. I think I'll attempt to bring in some of the Q&A now, if that's all right. I have a few questions as well, so I may follow up with my own. I'm going to go to Sneha's question, which I will say Sneha is a student. She's based in India, second year MAIA. And she's quite a long question. And Sneha, I'm not sure if I'm going to capture it in the summary. Can you see the question, Hahrie? Just out of curiosity in the Q&A?
Yeah, let me pull it up. I can see it, yeah.
I'll try and summarize it, but so you can see it for yourself in case you think I misinterpret it. She says, first of all, thanks for this illuminating talk and look forward to reading the book. And she wants to know about the varieties of ways in which asymmetrical interdependence can be manipulated as a source of power in changing the narrative of normalcy. And some of the things she highlights are concerns on how channels of communication are sort of being influenced by propaganda tendencies, misinformation, alienation, discrimination, and conflict. So that's a quick summary for the audience. I don't know, Hahrie, if you want to take that one on.
Yeah. So I should just say, you know, I have a colleague at SNF Agora, who's a faculty member named Henry Farrell, who's also a faculty at SAIS, who studies weaponized interdependence, like not in the context of movements, social movements per se, but he sort of has this idea about the way in which the kind of asymmetrical interdependence of different actors can often be weaponized, right, in ways that sort of shape power dynamics that emerge. He's looking more at state, like sort of, you know, actors at the level of the state. But I think that notion can be sort of cascaded down to the kind of organizations that we're looking at. I guess I would say, if I'm understanding the question correctly, that for a lot of these organizations, I mean, this is why the challenge of building the constituency became the kind of central challenge of the design choice that emerged, right? Is that all the people that these organizations were working with are embedded in a kind of like information ecosystem where they're getting both, you know, they're getting all different kinds of information that come at them, right? Some of which is propaganda, some of which is disinformation, some of which is accurate information. And all of these people are having to like sift through like what's true and what's not, and what do I believe and what's not, you know, what do I not believe? And each person is making a set of independent choices about that, right? And so the movement, in a sense, is trying to break through, right, and fight for the right to kind of shape the way that these people began to interpret the world around them, right? And so I'm reading news from Fox, and I'm reading news from the New York Times, and I'm hearing things that my barber told me, and I'm hearing things at the grocery store, and you know, all this kind of stuff is coming at me. And am I going to believe what Amos is telling me about what's going on in the preschool campaign, right? Or am I going to believe what the New Virginia Majority is telling me about formerly incarcerated citizens in Virginia or something like that, right? And what we found was that the way that the kind of the advantage that the organizations, the movements that we studied had in that complex information ecosystem was greatest when they had people embedded in social relationships that meant that they would prioritize the information they got from those social relationships over information that they might get from other channels in their lives, you know? And so that's why that's part of the reason why that kind of horizontal network of relationship was so important, not only as a communications mechanism, but also as a mechanism for generating kind of widespread sort of distributed trust, right? Because we live in an environment where it's really hard to kind of trust the sort of information that was coming at you. And so essentially what ended up happening was that the way in which the movements were able to sort of turn the kind of information imbalances in their favor was when they were able to sort of embed people in relationships through which they communicated information, as opposed to just like an email list or something like that, you know. And some of these organizations, just kind of to get to Michael, your question before, some of those relationships could be like digital relationships, right? So it didn't have to be that like I saw this person and they told me this thing, right? It could be completely a sort of digital relationship, but it was more a question of, was it a trusting relationship or was it not, you know? And if you had that trusted relationship, then they were able to sort of shape the kind of information warfare, information battle much better than if they weren't.
And that's really interesting. I would love to pick up on that with my own question and one of Judy, who's got a few questions in the chat. Thanks, Judy, for kicking off that conversation. And that's to say, you talk a little bit about this kind of bridging effect of how organizations need to bridge differences between different identities rather than trying to polarize. And I wondered, what does that actually look like, what you just described in an organization? It comes a bit also to Michael's question, how do you actually study that? And Judy's question, it also relates to, as individuals become part of an association for social change and grow more committed to their cause, could that contribute to increasing polarization between ideologies and political parties? And it seems that you're saying no, because they're going to be bridging those differences. But can you just tell us a little bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah, so this is, so I will say, like, you know, so as those of you who have like done books, and Nina, I know you just had a book come out, kind of know, like, you know, one of the things that's kind of funny about doing books is that you write the book and then it doesn't come out for like 2 more years after that, you know? So like we wrote this book like 2 years ago, right? And then, and now it's coming out in 2021. And, you know, like I didn't know what 2021 would be like, right? When we wrote the book kind of a couple years ago, right? And I think that it's coming out, I feel like, in a moment where there are, I'm part of a lot of conversations where people see like activists as the problem, right? Because activists are the ones that are pulling us further apart in a variety of different ways, right? Because they're advocating for, and this could be activists on the right and activists on the left, like both of them are kind of like pulling us apart in different ways. And I do think there are movements and activists that do that, absolutely, like without a doubt. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. But what was interesting to me, and one of the things that was more surprising to me, is that a lot, like one of the things that we write about in the book is that the organizations that we studied, right, that we found as being ones that actually were able to kind of break through and become an outlier in succeeding and winning political power, were ones that kind of rejected this dichotomy between idealism and pragmatism, right? So I think very often in activist circles, sometimes it's sort of like, well, you know, if you give up anything of your ideals, then you're like a sellout and you can't, you know, you can't do this. And these organizations, I think, sort of rejected that sort of dichotomy, sort of thinking that we can be bold in the kinds of things that we're asking for. Like we can, you know, I'm Amos and, you know, I'm going to go and demand that we have a big enough tax that's going to provide good jobs for, you know, low-income Black women who run home daycares, right? And that was like totally not on the radar screen of the people who are designing universal preschool from the business community at all, right? And so that you can kind of be bold and be pragmatic at the same time if you have this like independent source of power, right? If you have a base of people that are actually kind of committed to you and are willing to kind of roll with you over time. Now, so there was a flexibility that came from that sort of need to sort of negotiate for kind of change and things like that. But then the other thing was that in order for these organizations to have a base that was big enough, they had to inevitably draw on these kind of bridging ties, Nina, that you're talking about, you know, that they had to be able to sort of like you know, a homogenous constituency often wasn't big enough to get them to where they needed to be. And so they had to sort of inevitably be kind of heterogeneous in their outreach. So then the question is, okay, like how do they actually do that? So here's like one really interesting thing that I feel like I learned from doing this project is that I think a lot of people, and the whole idea of bonding identities and bridging identities comes out of the social capital literature, right? It comes out of this idea that, you know, and a lot of people I think will think about the challenge of building bridging identities as a challenge of building social capital, right? If I just like get everyone like in a room and like kumbaya, like can't we all love each other? Like then like all things will be good, right? And I think what these organizations saw is that the work of building bridging identities was much more a function of structure than it was a function of social capital, right? And so the way in which it was a function of structure was the following. So if I'm part of an organization that's heterogeneous in a variety of different ways, then on the one hand, I want to have some relationships in the organization that are with people who are like me, so whatever that dimension of likeness and similarity is, right? But then on the other hand, in order for the organization to function, I also have to have relationships. You can't have like isolated pockets. I mean, so in the United States, a lot of this comes down to race, right? And you can't have isolated pockets of Black constituents, Latino constituents, Asian constituents, white constituents, and things like that. And so instead, you have to figure out how to sort of integrate across them. And that integration work was a function of structure, right? So did the movement organize a series of like cellular spaces, right, where they would create these opportunities for bridging to occur and then distribute the strategy out, right? And by distributing strategy, what that meant was that people who were in heterogeneous bridging type structures had some piece of work that they had to do together, right? And that piece of work became the concrete thing around which they developed their own kind of like collective agency and their relationships and sort of things like that. And so a lot of the work of building the bridging ties was a function both of like creating the kind of cellular structure that enabled those kind of ties to be created, but then also chunking the work in a way that sort of gave pieces of ownership to all the different kind of cellular pieces that you were creating.
It's really interesting. And I can imagine the amount of work you've done to get inside those processes is phenomenal in terms of more ethnographic work. So I'm also excited to see and read the book. And for SAIS students, if you're interested, we have ordered a copy for the library, just so you know.
For that.
Please feel free to ask more questions in the Q&A. I want to ask a question of my own now. One thing I wondered about is the characterization of some of the literature, because in the presentation, you also sort of showed, here's the assumptions, right? Here is the myths that we have or assumptions about how collective action operates. And one of the things I noticed that came out, and I think it was in a bit of the conclusion that I read, was that you said an assumption, at least in the US, for effective advocacy is the use of complex data targeting tactics. And this is about scale, right? So the idea is mobilize as many people as possible. And this gets a bit to Michael's question. You do that online, right? So you're able to mobilize lots of people because you have all of these initiatives, you elected them via online petition, and then you can like say whatever, 10,000, 20,000 people have signed your petition. And your argument is that like that doesn't necessarily work because it's not doing all of this deep organizing work. But I just wondered, in stretching, I'm pushing a little bit, like, is that accepted as, the narrative of effective advocacy in the literature and more broadly beyond the US? Like, I'm aware that US advocacy groups are so good at it, but I just feel like, coming back to the first question, a lot of groups outside of the US don't have the capacity to operate on that scale or to do that sort of digital analytics. And certainly in my world of international relations, people, don't consider NGOs even doing this at all. So I guess it's a bit of a provocative question about the way that you see the assumptions of what is good advocacy and what the field of scholarship and practitioners think of that.
Yeah, well, this is something, I'd love, Michael, for your thoughts on what you see from the work that you've done in Australia and at Weizenbaum and everywhere, and Nina also for you to weigh in. Like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Like, I will say, like, I think, so I do think that so let me sort of take that in two parts. I think there's an answer in the context of the research literature, and then there's an answer in the context of the kind of the political ecosystem that movement organizations are working in. So in the research literature, I do feel like, from the early days of like Menker Olson, who sort of framed the free rider problem, like that became, such a dominant framework for how we think about the challenge of collective action, and so often, including my work too, the challenge in collective action is how do you get people to take action, right? And whether or not you accept the free rider problem, like I think it's still sort of basically true that like people think like for most people, politics is a mere sideshow in the circus of life, and most people don't do a lot of things. And so it's really hard for any organization to try to get like the attention that it wants, just to sort of say like, hey, we're out here like fighting to save, the spotted toad, like come help us, And so I do feel like there is this sort of notion in the literature that the big challenge is really just generating action, you know? And I think that what came with that kind of assumption is this notion that action, like that action is the goal, you know, that action becomes the sort of like outcome that we're striving for. And so we wanted to kind of like push back on that notion, you know, and I think that you're right, Nina, that when people kind of get into more nuanced discussions of sort of how collective action works, that sort of falls away. But I do think there is that sort of like underlying sort of baseline frame that sometimes dominates some of the discussions that we have. On the second thing, in terms of political ecosystem, so this is where, I mean, I would really love to hear what you all see from where the context that you're working in. I think in the US, even if the kind of data analytics that some organizations have, like Color of Change is a huge organization and they have access to very sophisticated data analytics, and that helps them develop a lot of their strategy. But a lot of the smaller organizations that we see, like even the United States, do not have access or capability or interest in those kinds of tools. But I do think they're working in a political ecosystem that, you know, very much tries to sort of push people to sort of say like, well, you know, what are the kind of like evidence-based things that you're doing that are true, that are working, you know? And I think that notion of like evidence-based is something that can be really challenging for groups that don't have the kind of data analytic infrastructure that you're working in. I think there's a lot that you're describing. And I do think that there are a lot of downstream consequences. Like I know why people want evidence-based work, of course, like I'm a social scientist, and so I too like evidence and evidence-based things. But I think what it does in the context of some of these movements is it pushes them into a context where they're trying to find tactical fixes to big strategic questions. And I think part of what we're trying to do in the book is push the conversation more to some of the bigger strategic questions and away from just the kind of tactical fixes that end up getting, you know, that end up getting to be the kind of things that these groups are often held accountable for. But I'd be really curious to hear what you guys see in the places that you're working.
Michael, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really interesting question because I think it's something that is contested in an ongoing way by the political actors themselves. And so what you see is that different organizations value and measure their effectiveness in different ways, and also compete within a shared field of action about which standard is the best. So, I mean, I can speak more freely, I guess, about the Australian context because I'm more familiar with it. But, you know, so you saw a kind of very involved debate about mobilizing, organizing, the organizing model in the trade union movement, in other organizations. And I mean, I would say that there was a general movement towards enthusiasm for the principle of organizing over time. But I really agree with what you said, Hahrie, that the pressure to generate measurable action has almost co-opted the idea of what that organizing should look like, because it doesn't always just have to be large-scale analytics. It can be numbers of doors knocked. It can be numbers of signatures on a petition. And so I think that those being the immediate ways to even measure field organizing can subtly reorient, I guess, what is actually being pursued through those actions. So and I guess that's why I like the idea of the book, and I'm excited to see how the reception goes, because I do think it's kind of directed to exactly those conversations. And I would be interested to know and to, I guess, see the response of people as they pick up those ideas, because I'm sure there will be many, you know, conference presentations and workshops on the more practitioner side that talk about these questions.
I mean, in my own experience, I guess just isolating it on the concept of digital analytics, it's something I've been thinking a lot and building off, as you know, Dave Kapp's work on analytic activism. My own book is asking some of these questions. It's saying, how do groups like Color of Change or Move On, or for the German audience, Campact, or 38 Degrees in the UK that are digitally built, but use digital analytics to survey their members, figure out what to campaign on, figure out how to frame. And a lot of it is about scale. A lot of it follows, this argument that you make. It's about mobilizing as many people as possible. But my hunch from my work is that most of these groups, at least when they started, 10 years ago, were at the forefront in their own contexts. So there's about 20, I have about 20 countries from Poland, New Zealand, South Africa, there's groups in India, and there weren't other groups thinking in that way. That was the whole reason they emulated the model. So they sort of stood out on their own as trying to do something, and they even found it difficult to explain the way that they were operating. And other groups, other civil associations and NGOs might have to report on impact, but they would do so through, reporting to their funders or to donors. And it might be still about how many people you turn out or how many people sign a petition, but they didn't have the sort of sophisticated digital analytics. So I guess I have quite a specific kind of take on the reading. I'm not quibbling with the argument about mobilizing and scale, but more specifically about the use of digital analytics by groups to measure what they do. And it's actually one of the questions that Michael and I are asking with Annette, who's I think also here, is how do groups on the right, do they use digital analytics to campaign? So I guess my hunch is that the US civic and association world is much further, or there's higher expectations and pressure, even if groups aren't all doing it. Yeah.
Wait, so you're saying that like the groups don't use the digital analytics as much?
I guess I'm saying that they're outliers that do in other countries. Yeah.
But then what about the context within which they're working? Like, is there an expectation for them to work in ways that are like tactical, or, some like what how is the context within which they're working changing? Like, I know that you're saying that they're pioneers kind of at the outset, but how do you feel like that context is changing now?
I think it's a fair question. I think there are other NGOs that are starting to replicate and try and do it. Like I know Oxfam and Greenpeace have, experimented with online petitions and distributing power and like building up, scale. And I do know as well, this is kind of the flip side, and I guess your argument, that organizing has not been given purchase or as much priority in many of these cases, and now many of the sort of groups, the digital first groups I was talking about, are looking at doing that more. And this is a bit of an informal piece of information. I haven't got any proof for it, but I once had a conversation with somebody who's trying to train organizers in Germany, and he claimed that no one in Germany does organizing, not even the unions. He said the unions have like outsourced it to like some organization to train them in how to actually organize properly. So, I mean, that's credit for your argument. I don't know, Michael, maybe you had something you wanted to add to that.
Well, I mean, just in defense of the organizing culture of Germany, I guess, as my adoptive home, an exception to that, I think, is that especially some of the social movements around housing issues, you actually do see some of these kind of organizing and actually kind of when you talked about cells that distribute the work and create these bridging identities, you see exactly that kind of structure around some social movements around housing, around exactly questions of racial identity and local neighborhood identity. So I think that it does exist in some parts of political culture, but it's interesting that, for example, in the trade union movement, it's very different.
I mean, I will say part of what I feel like is coming up in this conversation, Nina, and the questions that you're asking, which I think are so important, is, and we don't talk about this explicitly in our book, but I think it's implicit in the book. And this is one of those things where it's like 2 years ago when I wrote the book, I wasn't thinking about it, but now I'm thinking about it a lot, And so if I could rewrite the book, like I would do parts of it differently. I also think that there's a way in which some of the work that these groups are doing is forcing us, like me as a scholar, to kind of rethink the way that we understand the kind of representational relationship in the 21st century, you know? So there's a representational relationship that exists between leaders and members, like the heads of organizations and the members who they like purport to represent, like in the political sphere, you know, and then there's a representational relationship between the leaders of the organizations and then the elected officials when they are negotiating with elected officials or sort of policymakers that they're trying to work with. And I think that at both levels, there's a way in which the 21st century, in part because of the sort of availability of these digital tools and the work of the groups that you profile in your book, Nina, have forced us to kind of rethink what does representation look like in the 21st century, you know, and our models are stuck in like what was created in like the 18th, 19th, 20th century, really, where it's sort of like, you know, whoever the leader was in either one of those contexts couldn't be in as frequent conversation with members, you know, and so the way in which information flows now is very different. But I think that right now it feels like in the sort of dominant models of collective action that we have, that representational relationship both between leaders and members and leaders and policymakers is dominated by this idea of like, I ask for what I want and either it's like a take it or leave it kind of game, you know? So I try to get Nancy Pelosi to do something and I'm gonna like sit it in your office and either you like do what we say or you don't, you know? Or I'm a member and I'm like, I'm gonna fill out this petition. And if you guys aren't gonna do what I want, I'm gonna go find another organization that does. And there's this kind of like take it or leave it sort of notion of how that relationship looks. And I think part of what these groups are doing is sort of remaking structure. And this is why structure, I think, becomes so important instead of just social capital, remaking structures through which it's not a take it or leave it conversation, but instead it's a negotiation between leaders and members and between leaders and policymakers. So, you know, what's different about the kind of data analytics framework, which I think is dominated, and I think this is what Dave says, at least in, I haven't read his work in a while, but, you know, at least in his work is that, you know, it's sort of like they were listening mechanisms to kind of listen to what people heard. But I think these organizations sort of saw themselves not as just kind of listening, but as being in a two-way conversation where both the leader and the member are shaped by the kind of conversation that's going on between them, you know? And so the question is, how do you create the sort of structures and mechanisms to enable that kind of two-way conversation to occur?
And speaking of conversation, I'd love to keep going, but I think we should bring others into this conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
Back to the Q&A. There's a couple of interesting questions here. One is from Judy. I might ask two in a row if that's all right.
Yeah.
About how your concepts can be applied in the workplace, such as organizing around anti-racism policies, DEI committees, although I'm not familiar with that acronym. So if anyone is, please feel free to clarify it.
Yeah.
And then we have a question. I'll ask, Sneha's got a follow-up question about some of the dichotomies you present in the book between idealism and pragmatism, working inside the system and outside the system, articulating a bold vision and making political compromises. And she says, are these alternatives in and of themselves to these movements? And drawing from your experience, can both kinds of movements coexist, or will there always be trade-offs? So I guess she's keen to understand the relationship between these extremes and how movements navigate them.
So in the first question about, so DEI, I think, stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
And so a lot of corporate environments these days are very focused on trying to think about how they promote DEI, do DEI work within their companies and their workplaces themselves. And so the question about how these concepts can be applied in the workplace. I think this is like, now I'm a little bit out on a limb here because I don't know this for sure, but my very cursory understanding of the way that a lot of corporations will do DEI work is they come in, they find some training, and they bring in some training, and then they put people, like everyone in the company or everyone in their workplace kind of goes through this training on DEI, and then they hope that has success, right? And most of the research on those DEI trainings is that for the most part, they're either they have no effect or they actually create a backlash, right? So very often when you go in and you do DEI work and you have this kind of like one size fits all sort of training, then it actually creates a backlash from people who feel like they don't, that it doesn't seem to speak to their experience, in a variety of different ways. And I think that, so then the question is, okay, well, if we sort of accept that what we learn from the DEI literature is that most people can't be changed, right, in the way that like a prism, quote unquote, might argue for, then how do these findings apply? So to me, one thing that's very different from what we're talking about versus what like these DEI trainings typically do is that we're not saying that like the way that these organizations act as a prism is that they come in and they have a training and they put everyone through the training and then force people to go from being like agents of social change to being consumed, you know, or whatever. Like, it's not like they just sort of put people through a training, but instead the transformation happens through the kind of structures and opportunities and relationships that they create for the kind of work that we're describing and the relationships that we're describing to emerge, right? So they're not trying to manage people or change people. What they're doing instead is they're managing interactions, right? They're managing the kind of nature and structure of the interactions that people have. And then if change emerges or transformation occurs, it occurs not because I went to some 6-week training that my boss made me go to. It happens because I got into a relationship with Michael, and through the work that I did with Michael, I began to sort of see the world in a different way, right? And so it's a subtle pivot from this idea of trying to sort of manage people and make people see the kind of ways in which we all carry racism in our hearts, right? But instead, how do we manage the interactions through which people can sort of where the kind of natural sort of organic kind of transformation can begin to occur. And so how can these concepts be implied? Like, I have no idea if there's any corporation in America or in the world that would sort of think about it in that way, but kind of, another metaphor that I use sometimes when I talk to people is that, very often and this gets to our conversation about scale too, is that very often when we're thinking about movements, people want to like figure out, how do you like strike a match? Like, what's the match that's going to light the whole log on fire, right? And really, for anyone who's ever tried to start a fire out in the woods, right, you can't strike a match and light the entire log on fire, right? What you do is you strike a match and you light the kindling on fire, and the kindling heats up the log, and then the log catches on fire, right? And so the way to think about this is that like these organizations were striking a match that was lighting the kindling on fire. The kindling were the core leaders, right? And they were the ones that were leading these kind of cellular structures and stuff that we're talking about. And then if they're doing their work right, then they would kind of organically heat up these logs that would then, become the sort of movement that we're talking about. And so to me, in the kind of like the workplace context, the challenge is, if I'm a corporation, I'm trying to figure out how to do this work. The question is, who are the people that are the kindling? Right. And then how do I light the match that lights the kindling on fire, who then, becomes a kind of log? On this question, so I'm not sure if I totally understand the question about the sort of different kinds of movements. So I'm not necessarily saying that there's like some movements that are idealistic and some movements that are pragmatic and some movements that work inside the system and some movements work outside the system, but more it's an idea that like, I think very often we see those things as being like a dichotomy. So you can only work inside the system or work outside the system. And part of what these organizations that we studied were doing is they were doing both, so they were deeply in relationship with elected officials, which would be a kind of inside the system type of strategy, but they were also not afraid to call those elected officials out when they felt like they weren't doing the right thing, and because of and this kind of gets to what we were just talking about the nature of the representational relationship, that like, I think our assumptions about representation are that you can only do one or the other, right? Either I'm in the pocket of the elected official, or I'm the person who's sitting in their office and calling them out for being a sellout, right? And these organizations are saying like, no, like you can be both. You can be someone who tries to hold them accountable, and you can be someone who is in relationship with them, but that's only possible if they're willing to enter into that relationship with you. Now, why are they willing to enter into that relationship with you? Because you have something valuable to offer. What do you have to offer? You have this constituency, right, that is actually committed and trusts you. That's different from an organization that doesn't have that constituency.
So I'm aware we're coming up almost to time. So if any of you have been holding back on your questions, now is the time. It's now or never. I have one question I might ask. Michael, if you have any final question, and then I think I might give the last question to Judy, unless we have any others in the chat, because I think she has a nice question to end on. So does that sound like a good plan, Michael? Yeah, Hahrie? Okay. So I wanted to ask a question which blends into something I'm thinking about for my next project, Hahrie, which you've already had a short sample of, which is, you talk about movement-based organizations, and most of the ones, from my understanding, are ones that are working with individuals that are being affected by something in their community, say racism or don't have voting rights. And so they're advocating on their own behalf or advocating for people that are within their community. So there's quite a direct effect on them personally. Do you think that this works, this understanding of kind of constituency-based organizations and your theories around how they work best in cases of organizations campaigning for other people's rights far away? So my question really is, what happens if you're a group that's campaigning for, I don't know, Syrians in Syria or people in India right now? How does that change the nature of the relationship between the leaders and the constituents? And how might your theories need to be rethought or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the full answer to that, to be. So one thing to be clear is that so in some cases, the leaders of the organizations were drawn from the constituencies that they were advocating for. So for example, in Arizona, the leaders of the organizations that we looked at most closely were themselves immigrants, and they were fighting for immigrant rights. But like in Virginia and Ohio, the leaders of the organizations were not drawn from the constituency for whom they were fighting. So in Virginia, they were fighting for voting rights for formerly incarcerated citizens. The leaders of the organization were not themselves formerly incarcerated, right? Nor were they Black, which is what in Virginia, the vast majority of the formerly incarcerated population is Black Americans, So that was sort of one situation. And then also in Ohio, in the case that I described, they were fighting for universal preschool, which primarily would benefit the kind of low-income Black community in Cincinnati. And the leader of the organization was a white man who was a former preacher himself. So he did come from the faith community, but he was not Black, And so we had kind of like both of those things going on. But the question that you're asking is different in the sense that, like, even if Troy Jackson is the head of the organization and he's fighting for the Black community in Cincinnati, he's still a resident of Cincinnati, even if he's not drawn from that constituency, which is different to say, like, I live in Cincinnati and I'm going to fight for Syrian refugees who are halfway around the world. And like, that's a very different kind of thing. So, and this is a question that I don't have the right answer to, but here's what I would say. The question that I always ask organizations that are doing work in that way is essentially like, who are your people? And I think an organization does need to have an answer to that question, right? So I think to me, it's a little bit context dependent for the organization, but I could see being an organization based in Baltimore, Maryland, which is where I am, that fights for Syrian refugees. And I think of my people as the refugees themselves, right? Then I feel like when I'm thinking about whose independence and commitment and flexibility do I need to cultivate? It's the independence, commitment, and flexibility of my people, of the refugee community, right? And if I need to do that from afar for whatever reason, like, then I need to do that from afar, right? But another way to think about it, when you say, who are my people, is I'm trying to mobilize a group of people in the United States to act on behalf of these refugees, right? Then my people are the group of people in the United States that I'm trying to mobilize, And so I think that, like, to me, it's not like different organizations can have different logics for how they answer that question. But like, that's the question that needs to be answered, is like, who do I think of as my people and who is a constituency that I'm developing? And then I feel like then the question is like, okay, so then, the kind of principles of uncertainty and strategic choice and all that kind of stuff, I would argue, would still be relevant.
Thanks, Hahrie. Michael, did you want to ask any final question?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question out of curiosity that is not specifically about the book content, but more about doing the style of research that this book is. So, you wrote a book that was both for practitioners and academics, and then there was, lots of discussion about it, and this book falls into that same broad category. And in between, you've spent a lot of time talking with and working with some of the case study people in the book. So I just wonder, for people who are doing research, planning research, thinking about future careers in research, what does that process tell you about how to produce meaningful research, especially that serves the people who appear in the book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And first of all, I appreciate that to me, that you're saying what to me sounds like very nice things about our previous work. So thank you for that. I will say, I think I thought a lot about this question of what the relationship between practitioners and academics should be, because I think very often academics do work where the audience is really just academics, and I feel like I've always wanted to try to do work that helps shape the kind of thinking of the groups that I'm studying in my work. And to me, the real challenge or one big pivot came when I sort of began to understand the difference between thinking about research as program evaluation and thinking about research as getting at like core questions about strategy. So I think a lot of times when practitioners come to academics seeking partnerships, it's for one of two reasons. Either it's because they need program evaluation, like we're doing this thing, we want someone to help us like evaluate, figure out if it works, right? Or it's because they're doing this thing that they think works and they want someone to write it up and validate it, and I think those are things, like, those are both important things and they happen a lot. But what I found is that for me personally, at least, like that wasn't what was most interesting to me. Like I didn't become a program evaluator for a reason, right? Like I was more interested in trying to figure out what are the questions that are at the forefront of strategic thinking for the organizers, but also conceptual thinking and theory building for academics, right? Like I wanted to figure out like, what are the things that we haven't figured out yet in academia? And what are the things that organizers are struggling with right now? And then what's the sort of Venn diagram, like the place of overlap between those two things? And so often when a practitioner comes to me and asks about, this study or that study, like the question that I'll give back is like, really what I want to know is I want to know what keeps you up at night. What are the things that you're worried about your organization or your movement, and like what's keeping you up at night? And then we begin to kind of get it to a level where we're not just trying to like evaluate a tactic or something like that, but we're kind of probing what are the fundamental assumptions that they bring to their work. And then how does that overlap or not with the assumptions that scholars have about how that world works, And if they're the same, it's interesting. If they're different, it's interesting. And it's like getting the conversation to that level, I think is one thing that I've learned a lot, over the years. So
I think that's a really interesting note to segue to our final question from Judy about how do you see your findings changing for the next decade, if at all? What are the people telling you when they come and have those conversations now about what's keeping them up at night and what's the next book, I guess?
Yeah, I don't know the next book. Well, I do know the next book is about. The next book is about, I'm working on a project where I'm looking at evangelical churches in America and how they are navigating questions of faith and race, but it's a little bit of a different topic. But, and then I think I may not write any more books because they're too hard to write. But I will say, here's what I have been thinking about in the movement context is that I was recently reading this piece that was talking about strategy and how movements develop strategy. So I think we talked a little bit about strategy in this book, but I think there's still like a lot more that we could do. And someone made the point that like the whole concept of strategy was actually built around the military, right? When generals would develop strategy and then the soldiers had to like execute it on the battlefield, right? And that notion of strategy was developed when information was hard to access, right? Communication channels between generals and soldiers was not as good or as frequent, right? And that the past was a relatively good predictor of the future, right? And now we live in a world where none of those things are true. The past is no longer a good predictor of the future, right? Information is not hard to access, it's very easy to access, and communication channels are too frequent in some ways. It's like we have too many communication channels as opposed to too few. And so the challenge of building strategy now is not to come up with a really good plan, like a really good plan for battle, right? But instead, it's to sort of map the terrain within which you're working and then have a really good compass to help you navigate that terrain, right? And so for social movements, like this is again, like thinking back to that point of uncertainty, it's like, I can imagine right now how they map the terrain within which they're working, right? Like I think movements are actually really good at sort of understanding how they understand the kind of power dynamics in the space within which they're working and stuff like that. But I think that question of how do you develop that compass, right? When you can't give everyone a strategic plan that they're going to follow or a script that they're going to follow, how do you develop that compass that helps people navigate that terrain? I think is in my mind, it feels like a really open question, right? And it's an open question both at the level of how do leaders develop that compass, but then also how do they distribute those ideas, through this like network of distributed strategists, you know, that they're creating. And I think that we don't yet quite know the answer to that question. So.
Fantastic. Well, a big round of applause from me to you both. Michael, thank you for being the discussant, and Hahrie for presenting what's really fascinating research. And thank you all to all of our participants, people who asked questions, those of you who sat in. It's been a real delight to have this. And I hope that we can continue the conversation on the next pieces of work and other work that comes out of also, the Agora Foundation. It's great.
Yeah, thank you, Nina, so much for organizing it. And thank you, Michael, for being the discussant. It was super fun. So
yeah, thanks. Great discussion.
Alrighty.
Well, have a lovely rest of your day, everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.